Media multiplexity theory is a useful tool to help us understand why individuals would choose to use one medium rather than another. Remember that a medium is simply a tool through which we can send and receive messages between individuals. These mediums can be anything from Facebook, sending broad messages, to face-to-face could be a medium. Maybe I want to send an email or a text message. Maybe I want to do a video call. Maybe I want to create a video and send it over YouTube. All of these are mediums that we can use to send messages. But why would we choose to use one medium rather than another medium? And then how do those choices affect our relationships? That's what we're going to look at today with this really simple theory. A couple of assumptions of the theory. First, we assume that the types of media people choose depends on the social network. In other words, we choose to use mediums that we see our friends and family members using because they now become tools to communicate with our social networks. Let me give you a quick example. When Instagram came out, I did not like it. I didn't like the way it was designed. I didn't like the type of content that was on it. My cousin, however, decided to delete his Facebook account and only use Instagram. After a few years, he reached out and said, I don't get to see you as much because we don't use the same medium. Could you please get an Instagram account so that way we can still stay connected? That is what motivated me to get my first Instagram account. So it was my social network that drove me to use the medium. You probably have seen the same thing where you start a new job and your boss asks you to use a certain form of communication, or maybe you created a new relationship and the person you're creating a relationship with likes a medium that you have never used before. So our relationships push the types of mediums we choose. The number of mediums we use with that individual depends on how strong our relationship is with that person. Typically, stronger relationships tend to use more mediums. Think about how you connect with your mom. You probably talk to her face-to-face. You probably use text messaging, phone calls. You probably connect with her on social media. You probably have lots of ways that you can think of how to communicate with your mom. Now think about someone from high school who you haven't seen in a few years. How many ways can you think of that you can contact them? Probably not quite as many. So stronger relationships tend to use more mediums than weaker relationships. Now the property of the medium does not determine how we use the medium or what we talk about. Now this is an interesting assumption. When Twitter came out, people thought by restricting the number of characters you could use, it would change what people talked about. And for a while it was sort of true. Twitter began mostly as a political platform. But now you can see all sorts of things discussed on Twitter. And so it's not the medium that determines what we talk about, it's the relationships that determine what we talk about. And finally, this media selection is repetitive and based off of our hierarchical structure that we come up with on our own. In other words, once we get comfortable using a medium, we tend to use it over and over again. And in our minds, we have a sort of grade that we give each of these mediums to rate them against one another. And my hierarchy is going to be different than your hierarchy. For example, I tend to think that it's unprofessional to send text messaging in a professional setting. Instead, I use email. So email is higher in my hierarchy than text messaging when it comes to professional emails or professional messages. Now, your hierarchy might be slightly different. Maybe you like to use LinkedIn and then Facebook, or maybe somebody else prefers a different hierarchy. But this hierarchy determines when we choose one medium over the other. Our relationships are categorized by either weak or strong ties. And this is important because it determines how the mediums affect our relationships. Most of us have a lot of weak ties. Weak ties are connections with people who we have some sort of small relationship with, but we don't feel necessarily close to them. So maybe this is your neighbor that you see once a week and you wave to them. Maybe it's your friend from high school who you think of occasionally but you don't talk to a lot. These are weak ties, people you're connected to, but their choices don't really influence your choices. Strong ties are those with whom we have close relationships. So typically romantic partners, your family members, somebody that you see often, and their actions influence your actions. The reason why this is important is our media choices influence our relationships. But our media choices influence weak ties differently than they influence strong ties. Let's look at weak ties. I'm thinking right now of a friend from high school who I haven't talked to in 12 years. I like him. He was a really cool guy. We're connected on Facebook, but that's the only time I ever see any updates from him. Now, if I decided I wanted to get rid of Facebook, if I deleted this medium from my life, I'm also, in essence, deleting this individual from my life. I don't know his email address. I don't know his home address. I don't have his phone number. I have no other way of contacting him other than through Facebook. So weak ties are influenced greatly by our media choices. Anytime we add a medium or we delete a medium, we completely restructure our weak ties. Strong ties are not affected in the same way. Or a couple years ago actually, when I decided to stop using one of my social media accounts, I didn't lose contact with my mom. I didn't lose contact with my siblings, with my romantic partners, my close friends. These people who I'm close with, deleting or adding a medium doesn't really have a lot of impact on the relationship itself. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a concept that we typically talk about when it comes to face-to-face communication. But then I want to draw its connection to virtual communication. Immediacy, or nonverbal immediacy, is using our nonverbal cues to show our conversation partner that we are engaged in the conversation. This could be things like eye contact, head nods, showing that we're paying attention and we're not distracted. Nonverbal immediacy is really important because it helps us get on a psychological wavelength that allows communication to be more effective. It also makes people feel more comfortable and at ease during the conversation. In face-to-face conversations, immediacy is important for creating intimate relationships. Immediacy helps people feel more positive emotion. So as we talk to people who are engaged in a conversation, we tend to like them more. We tend to trust them more. We tend to want to create a relationship with them. It also decreases our anxiety and our apprehension during a conversation when both people are being immediate. So it makes us more willing to share, to go into intimate conversation. If we are more immediate during conversation, it also helps us to remember what we talked about and be able to then engage in the conversation at a more intimate level. And finally, both people tend to be more satisfied when we use nonverbal immediacy, when we're not distracted by our phones, when we're not distracted by other conversations, we're engaged with this conversation, the conversation tends to be more satisfying. Let's look at what some of these nonverbal immediacy cues might look like. Things like eye contact, body movement, using touch, using facial expression, and proxemics can all help us show or convey that we are paying attention. Think about if you're trying to talk to me and I'm turned and looking the other direction. Obviously, you're not going to feel like I'm very immediate. You're going to want me to turn my body towards you, maybe lean forward, make some head nods, make eye contact, show that I'm engaged in this conversation. If I pull out my phone and I'm distracted by my phone, you're not going to feel like I am really immediate or paying attention to this conversation. Now, I do want to make one quick note here, and that is that sincerity matters. People can tell when you're faking it. People can tell when you're showing eye contact, when you're pretending like you're engaged, but you're not actually engaged. We call this pseudo-listening, or pretending like we're listening when we're not listening, and that actually has the opposite effect of immediacy. So immediacy is important, but we need to be sincere about it. We need to honestly care about the individuals with whom we're communicating. So this brings us to our dilemma today. How do we combine the concepts of media multiplexity theory with immediacy? Remember, media multiplexity theory is the idea that we want to connect with other people who are not physically present with us. So we use mediums to connect with them. But immediacy is the idea that we also need to be connected with those that are physically present or near us. So we're going to help my buddy Tim out and talk about ways to stay connected virtually and be able to show those nonverbal immediacy signs without using them nonverbally. So how can we still build that immediacy, show people we're paying attention without these cues that we use? So virtual immediacy. Here's what it typically looks like. The biggest factor to virtual immediacy is chronemics. Chronemics is communication using time. So if my friend sends me a text message, I typically should respond in a timely manner. That doesn't mean I need to drop everything else and go to my phone. In fact, that is problematic if we're so addicted to our phones that we always respond right away. But it is important to respond in a timely manner, or at least to communicate with our friends about when it's appropriate to respond. For example, I typically don't respond to text messaging within a day or two. It usually takes me about a week because it's a lower hierarchy for me. So I've communicated that to all my friends, that if they would like to talk to me, they should give me a phone call, or they can send me a text message and I'll get back to them as soon as I get to it. So having these conversations is really important. When it comes to emailing, at least professionally, we tend to set the standard of responding within 24 hours. That doesn't mean you have to have all the answers ready within 24 hours, but typically showing that we've at least received the message within 24 hours is appropriate. It's a way of showing we're here, we're engaged in the conversation, we are immediate. Verbal immediacy is also useful with virtual communication. So you can't see my smile when I send you an email. You can't see my body movement. You can't see my energy or my lack of energy. So putting in the extra effort to explain those emotions by using verbal language can help show that I'm caring and that I'm paying attention. Emojis are a helpful tool now that a lot of people are incorporating. I'd be careful when using them in professional communications. Watch and see what your colleagues are doing and your boss is doing before you incorporate them in. But they're useful in showing the actual emotions that we're feeling. So when appropriate, using emoticons can help us to demonstrate deeper levels of emotion. And finally, video calls. This is an awesome technology that allows us to incorporate some nonverbal into even virtual conversations. So although we can't see everything, and you can still hide some things in video calls, if you have to have an emotional conversation with someone, I encourage you to consider a medium that allows you to have some degree of nonverbal communication. The last note today is I encourage you to have this conversation with your family members or your social networks. Meta communication is the process of communicating about our communication. So sitting down and having a conversation about how they expect to have you pay attention to their messages, to respond to the messages, how they respond to these virtual messages can help you be more successful in your communication.